Exalted, the biggest success to come out of set 11. Even during the 5-year anniversary where the best traits are among us, I am still certain that Exalted is the best trait of all time. I love Exalted so much that I climbed all the way up to Master, playing only Exalted every single game. I've learned so much and I'll take you through everything. My journey, what I've learned, and the downfalls of Exalted, because this trait is far from perfect. For example, Teemo is unplayable with Exalted, and for the same reasons units like Aurelia and Lillia are incredibly overpowered. But there's no way for you to know that without the identifiers that I've discovered that I'll also share with you today. But overall, this Exalted journey has been amazing, so thank you to those who tuned into my stream during it. If you want to catch me live, I stream both here on YouTube and on Twitch, but now let's go back to the beginning of my Exalted journey on stream. Initially when my challenge started, I was aiming for 5 Exalted every single game. It was fine at the start, but I quickly realised that was solely due to being able to hit level 10 consistently every game. As I reached high elos, I started to be heavily punished for how greedily I was playing, and at some point it genuinely became impossible to climb any more with 5 Exalted. My board was just losing too much by investing deeper into Exalted and not other damage or tank traits. Now 5 Exalted has seen numerous buffs since then, however I still ran into the exact same issues when I re-attempted the 5 Exalted strategy more recently. While the extra damage at 5 is nice, oftentimes 5 Exalted just weakens your board, particularly your frontline. In fact, I would even argue that in some cases you're actually losing damage by playing 5 Exalted due to its multiplicative nature. Let's take Arcanist as an example. Investing deeper into Arcanist will give you way more raw AP, which then scales higher with crit and then even further with damage amp. You can make the same argument for traits like Trick Shot as well. The extra damage and XP you gain just isn't worth it until you're incredibly high level and you can field every single unit and some extra legendaries so you're not losing out. However, that just defeats the purpose of Exalted in my opinion. Sure, playing around legendaries is strong and effective, but it's not nearly as creative and unique as other combinatorics. But let's expand more on the Exalted combinatorics because that is a potential flaw. Some Exalted combinations are phenomenal, whereas others are just terrible, and there's no way for you to know this without looking at the stats. But now I'll talk about how I can instantly tell if an Exalted combination was good or bad. First, let's start by looking at these two combinations. This one with Caitlyn, Teemo, Yorick, Volibear, and Syndra, and this one with Janna, Shen, Tristana, Yone, Nautilus, and Syndra. It's pretty clear instantly that the number of possible combinations for the former is limited, whereas the latter has so many more possibilities due to just having more units. But that's also due to the cost distribution within this combination. With 2 2 costs, 2 3 costs, and 2 4 costs, you can reroll Janna with Shen, Tristana with Yone, or you could play around 4 costs like Lillia and Lee Sin. So as a player, you have a plethora of options with this Exalted combination, and so you can more easily play around other variables in your game such as items, augments, and encounters. And that is exactly what permits a good Exalted combination, the ability to facilitate the player's creativity to conjure unique boards. However, Exalted will still favour and be more impactful for high cost units. The stats also demonstrate this point where the best performers have many high cost units. Similarly, support units are fantastic in Exalted because they function without items and Exalted can enable them to be more supportive. This is and was especially true for Soraka as she heals through Altruist. And during my climb I tried to play Soraka as often as I could. I mean, with her help I managed to beat Elise in 3 of one of my games. Anyway, what's interesting is that out of the 60 Exalted combinations, there are only 2 where the average placement improves from 3 to 5 Exalted, and those combinations are the following 2. These combinations aren't big deviations from existing comps, and at most you need only play 1 low cost unit for 5 Exalted, and the value of playing Kha'Zix on your board through Heavenly is very high. Conversely, literally the worst Exalted combination is the one only consisting of 1 costs. 1 costs have severely low base power and need the trait commitments. Exalted is not enough to supplement this. That's why, regardless of playstyle around Exalted, I tend to avoid 1 costs. Generally, if I'm playing around a lower cost unit like Janna, I will re-roll them, but you can also aim for 8 or 9 to play around expensive units. And that is another facet to a good Exalted combination, whether or not it can support multiple different playstyles. But wait, surely that means that this Exalted isn't that bad because you can reroll Teemo and Yorick together, right? Well, firstly, Behemoth and Trickshot are very disjoint, where the only overlapping units are Cho'Gath and Udyr. But more importantly, Teemo's damage is very slow, and so it takes him a significant amount of time to get value from the Exalted damage amplifier. Prolonged combats do not favour Exalted. Exalted does not scale, especially as you struggle to activate deep trait breakpoints like Trickshot. So Teemo's DOT isn't very effective and 8 seconds is just too long. On the other hand, units like Kai'Sa, Lillia, and Irelia are phenomenal with Exalted, as their ults deal an incredible amount of burst damage far sooner into combat. This front-loaded damage also helps mitigate the losses of lower trait commitments because you're just one-shotting units very quickly into combat. Succinctly, Exalted favors front-loaded damage and ending combat as soon as possible. Burst is better than damage over time. Such is the nature of a flat damage amplifier, and that is why Teemo is unplayable with Exalted and why this Exalted combination is so bad. You have 0 front-loaded damage with 2 DOT scaling champions, which are Teemo and Syndra, and you have Caitlyn, who has an extreme downtime with a high mana cost. Comparatively, let's look at Irelia and Lillia. These two especially have fantastic spell rotations and very little downtime even with low investments into their traits. Lillia's Balls wipes the backline with her third cast, and similarly Irelia's cast nukes low HP units. But there is a DOT champion that is fine with Exalted, which is Morgana. She requires very little to come online, she has great targeting which frequently targets the backline, and her DOT duration is only 3 seconds. But this burst versus DOT dilemma is why I preferred rerolling so much, as those front-loaded kits became stronger. There are mild exceptions to this, however. For example, Janna isn't exactly front-loaded, but she scales incredibly quickly with Rageblade and Archangels. But moving on, by playing Exalted only, you learn what constitutes a good comp. That is due to an inherent issue with Exalted not having diverse properties, as it just gives you a damage amp and some XP. I have heard some people equate the XP to gold, but it's actually much weaker than that. Gold can be used to reach interest intervals sooner and compound more interest. The gold you get would become more gold. That is just instantly stronger than gaining XP. Nonetheless, a good comp usually meets a few criteria. Firstly, there's a reliable carry with enough single target to get through tanks. There is some AoE damage that can harass backliners or apply anti-heal. There's some CC that disrupts the enemy board, slows down their carries, and buys time for yours. Furthermore, good comps spike in power as you hit substantial intervals such as level 7, level 8, and level 9. You can't just see the Exalted combination, click on all adjacent legendary units, and somehow pray that Mortdog's Ghost takes the wheel and spawns in these units for you. You need to be realistic and define a clear comp path to prevent as much HP bleed as possible. Good comps have a mixture of these criteria, but you can't guarantee that if you dedicate your comp around the Exalted units. This may sound really obvious to say, but a good comp consists of good units. It can be really tempting to try activate as many traits as possible and play incredibly horizontally, however you should only do that for your good units. For example, you should be aiming to do this for units like Ornn or Lillia to enable them as your primary tank or carry. But you shouldn't be doing this for units like Volibear and Rek'Sai. These units are just fillers, and investing into them is not worth it. You do not get any rewards for more activated traits. Exalted is not set 10 Jazz or Stand United. But that's also why units like Annie are so good, because they need very little, if any, investment to function. Lastly, you should be avoiding redundancies as much as possible. For example, let's say you're playing Illaoi for Warden and Arcanist, but your primary carry is AD. AD carries don't scale that well with AP, and so the value of Arcanist isn't that high, and in turn Illaoi's value is diminished. In this case, it is better to replace Illaoi with Nautilus as you gain CC. Actually, I also want to mention that a good comp has outs. Perhaps you initially intended to reroll, but you missed. In that case, a secondary option is ideal to pivot to. For example, I've had games where I was aiming to reroll Janna, but I hit Lillia first. In these cases, I just play around Lillia instead. And this is the common occurrence due to the smaller bag sizes. I usually avoid re-rolling altogether if a unit is contested. From my experience, it just becomes vastly more expensive to continue re-rolling than to level. But your experience will certainly be different to mine. Inherently, Exalted can never truly be recreated or solved like many meta comps because it changes so dynamically each game. And even if there was an optimal comp for a specific Exalted, that will change based on how you're rolling your items and your augments. The first iteration of Exalted got the most important feature perfectly correct, its replayability. There are numerous permutations you can explore within a single combination, but there's also an entire 60 unique combinations. Exalted is a trait that is very core to what TFT is at its heart. I have been told that some new players gravitate towards Exalted to help them learn the set. Exalted taught them what units to play and how to fill in the board. This essentially condenses the set into a puzzle, and players just fill in the pieces. Just bear in mind that with TFT, and especially playing Exalted only, that most of your learning will be retrospective. For example, one of the biggest lessons I've learned is that you shouldn't tunnel on the comp you've cooked too much. Exalted usually grants an incredible amount of freedom, and so you can just play around with whatever you hit. Your flexibility is your advantage and the trait's strength, because you can play so many different variations and still get the trait output of the damage amp and XP. But as I mentioned, this trait is not perfect, and improvements can be easily made. For example, Exalted is and will always be more impactful for higher cost units as the stronger base units, easier to acquire and very consistent. That's where we start looking at an incredible property of Exalted where the input and output can be decoupled from the trait's functionality. Specifically, the input of your current level and the output of damage amp can be interchanged for other quantifiers entirely. And that is what will allow Exalted to come back. For example, the input could be replaced with the total star level of the Exalted champions, so lower cost units have an advantage over higher cost units. This would help and address the combinations where the Exalted units were all of the same cost. These combinations miss the fantasy they were trying to achieve because there just weren't rewards for rerolling these units and combining them into a comp. But there could also be other inputs as well, like the number of fielded units, the current stage, or even the amount of gold you have. And the output could easily be changed to be more akin to Set 10's Jazz, or maybe even Set 4's Elderwood trait to give it combat scaling. But the more important improvement needs to be made for 5 Exalted. As I mentioned, 97% of the Exalted combinations do not improve in placement from 3 to 5. Solely receiving more damage amp just doesn't make up for how much weaker you make your board with deadweight units. And while the extra XP was nice to get you to late game boards, it just wasn't enough to make your current board stronger. I believe that 5 Exalted should have granted some sort of tankiness like Jazz. However, a HP multiplier is inferior for bruises due to the HP multiplier from the trait. These stack additively, which diminishes the return for bruises, whereas it's multiplicative for other tank traits. Flat damage reduction or armor and MR is just generally a superior stat to receive. However, if 5 Exalted was buffed, then what happens to those 2 Exalted combinations that actually did get stronger at 5? Well, frankly, they're just too good. They have too many late game units, too much overlap, and they don't quite deviate enough. 60 is an incredible number of combinations, and it doesn't really need to be that high. 1 or 2 combinations being entirely removed won't be that noticeable. I'm fairly certain that during my climb there were combinations that I never saw. If the sheer number of combinations becomes an obstacle to make sure they're all good, then I would rather Riot drastically reduce the number of combinations. But I think just granting some tankiness of 5 Exalted will stop 3 Exalted always being better than 5. Now in return for drastically warping your comp, your deficits are actually offset. But maybe there's an even better additional reward of 5 Exalted than tankiness. Let me know what you think. The concern that I have with Exalted granting tankiness is that augments that also do the same would become exceedingly powerful. For example, augments like Three's a Crowd and True 2s already make your board absurdly tanky depending on the Exalted combination. Although maybe I'm just being too concerned. An example of the converse is Stand United. I think Stand United is godlike because it scales exponentially with Exalted, however I've not heard others talk about this combination. There's also a similar must take which is Cluttered Mind. The Exalted XP egg counts as a unit, so you have much more control over your bench and you're gaining 4 XP around. This keeps the option of re-rolling and Fast 9 open. I also wanted to cover hero augments as they're kind of a coin flip with Exalted. The 1 cost hero augments like Garen and Kobakos are really good because you can hit incredibly sooner, just play Vertical Bruiser or Warden and play whatever backline you want. But I have struggled with Midnight Siphon and Ethereal Blades due to not being able to invest into Behemoth or Umbral and just being contested. Taking these hero augments was super risky because I don't know if other players will contest and make it more difficult to hit. That's why 1 cost hero augments are better with Exalted because there is much lower risk of other players pivoting into and contesting the same line. 2 cost hero augments are extremely risky until 3-2 due to the existence of the plus hero augments for 2 costs. That is not the case for 1 costs and you can instantly know at 2-1 if you're contested. But generally a risk with hero augments and Exalted is harder committing to a line at 2-1. Flexibility is your advantage and throwing that away can be detrimental. But all in all, that is mostly what I've learned about Exalted. I have had so much fun playing this trait and I love it so much. But I'll be the bearer of bad news here and it seems that Exalted will not be in set 12 and even set 13 for that matter. As Riot revealed in the Learnings article, Exalted does not make sense to be in every set of TFT. This part is just shocking to me. Am I stupid for not understanding why it doesn't make sense for Exalted to be in every set? Would it become boring very quickly? Is there just not enough time? Or does the design structure not permit or have room for another trait like Exalted? I perceive Exalted to be like sprinkles that you add last when your cake is finished. So once the set is complete, they'll add a few combinations and boom, that's it, right? But perhaps that's incredibly obtuse and ignorant. I don't know. I'm just so sad at this news and I'm honestly gutted because Exalted only was a great way for me to keep engaged with climbing and ranked due to the game-to-game variance. But this bad news aside, I am still certain that set 11's biggest success is easily Exalted, and I cannot wait for this trait to reappear in TFT. But now I'll pass over the questions to you guys. What do you think about Exalted? Do you think it's the greatest trait of all time like I do? Are you disappointed Exalted won't be returning this year? And are you looking forward to set 12? Let me know in the comments and remember to subscribe. Anyway, check out these other videos if you want to see more from me. And as always, thank you for watching and I'll catch you in the next one.